Woo! Congratulations all the teams for making it to the final round. My name is Hassan, I'll be chairing this round. Judging alongside with me is Brett on my right, is Brett, and Natalie on my left, Ashwarya, Deborah. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to give his remark on the motion to this thing. Here.
The FIFA World Cup is an event that has attracted international attention worldwide to celebrate the idea of sports, to celebrate the idea of sportsmanship, and to celebrate the idea of football. So much that even the schedule of this tournament had to be rescheduled to account for watching the World Cup. But despite of all that, despite of the football matches, what the world fails to see is that human rights abuses have been committed in the hosting of this World Cup, especially and we tell you that we believe that these FIFA executives should be criminally liable for the human rights abuses that have been committed. What are the human rights abuses that have been perpetrated? We have seen that in order to host stadiums, in order to make sure that the stadiums in Brazil are suited for people for the publicity and for the people around, that they have actually chased out all the people living in squatters surrounding these kind of stadiums, surrounding these places where the matches are held without any compensation whatsoever, whereby these people the people living in Brazil were just told to get the hell out of the place, or else we will take action against you, we will use violence against you. And we tell you that that is the sort of human rights abuses that they have committed, that we believe that they should be held criminally liable for. What is our mechanism for today? We believe that we will elect a super court of law, such as like the International Criminal Court, if possible, to try them, and we will assure appropriate representation from the judges of the panel, and we will let the punishment be decided by the judges themselves. And we will also make sure that in addition to any punishment given to them, such as going to jail or going to jail, that we believe that we will make sure that these people pay adequate reparation or compensation to the people who they have committed the human rights abuses against. So I have one substantive for you today in regards to how we believe that this policy is justified. Yes.
What is the standard for criminal liability?
I was just getting to that. So we believe that the FIFA executives have a duty of care to the people in Brazil. What does this mean? This means that we believe that these people the FIFA executives have a duty of care to make sure that the people affected by them hosting the World Cup, by them running the events of the World Cup, such as the matches, such as the publicity, such as the areas, the stadiums, are not harmed in any significant way, or even if they are harmed, that they be given appropriate reparations or compensations. In the same way as how you as a shop owner have a significant duty of care to make sure the customers in your shop are not harmed, or let's say by hot coffee or by sleeping on puddles outside your shop. And so we tell you that the FIFA executives has breached this duty of care towards the homeless people surrounding the stadiums in Brazil when they eject them from these places, when they chase them out without any forms of compensation, knowing that these people have no other place to go to. And we tell you that this is a form of negligence, because as a corporation, they should have the foresight to see what are the repercussions of their actions. Then we tell you that we believe that these FIFA executives should know that as a result of them chasing away these people, these poor homeless people of Brazil, that these people will be harmed because they have no other way, no other no other place to go to, and that you should at the very least pay compensation to them. So why do we think that they should be criminally liable besides being civilly liable? Because we believe that they've committed a severe crime. Because first of all, what are the two yardsticks? Right? We believe that they have a guilty mind and a guilty act. By guilty mind, we mean that the FIFA executives know that these people are the people surrounding the area are dependent on the squatters. Like that is the only place, like homes that they have set up. That is the only way that they can live, that they can survive. That they are already at the situation whereby they have no other way to go, and that they are merely surviving on scraps or things like that. And we tell you that in status quo, that the living conditions of these people are so abject, and that the FIFA executives know this because they know that these people have no power to resist them. They know that these people have nowhere else to go. And we tell you that these people, and that the FIFA executives know that these people will die if they chase them out. These people will die of starvation. These people will die of competition with other poor people. These people will die from even worse living conditions. So we tell you that this is the guilty act that they have perpetrated. This is a sort of murder. We are willing to call it a murder or massacre or genocide or whatever you call it, murder of thousands or hundreds of people who have been evacuated by these FIFA executives. Why? Because we tell you that this is murder through inaction, whereby them knowing that these people who have been chased out, from the only home that they have known, the only place where they can actually survive, when their own government doesn't even provide enough welfare for them, and that these people systematically eject the homeless people away from their houses, will lead to them dying, will lead to them having worse living conditions than before. And so we tell you that this is the large severity of the crime that they have committed. In conclusion, we believe that despite hosting the World Cup and all the profits they can get from this FIFA executives can get, we believe that they should be held criminally liable for the human rights abuses that have been committed. And we believe that if you want to stand for the side of the poor homeless people, please go inside opening government.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and I call upon the Leader of Opposition to give his remarks. Here he is.
Here.
If everyone could turn off their phones and try to keep silent, so you guys can hear. Thank you. No.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Here.
Mr. Speaker, members of the staff, we think it's unfair to scapegoat FIFA executives for the failures of the governments in implementing and carrying out and hosting of the World Cup. Right? We think it's unfair to divert the attention of the real culprits for these kind of human rights abuses, pinning it and blaming it on FIFA because it's convenient and because it's easy to pin them as a responsible party, as opposed to actually taking the people who implement these policies on the ground, because FIFA executives never say that you should evict these individuals from this particular place. They never say that you should implement predatory hiring practices in your migrant workers. These are not policies that are dictated by FIFA, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that they're responsible. These are policies dictated exclusively by these governments for their own convenience. We think these are the individuals that should ultimately be held responsible. What will I do for you in my speech? Firstly, I'll characterize a little bit more the bidding process, especially, and how the checks and balances exist to prevent sort of abuses, right? And we'll look at also the foreseeability of these particular harms. Secondly, we'll analyze where these HR abuses happen, and we'll draw a distinction between actively causing harm versus a harm that occurs as a byproduct of the process. Thirdly, then we'll look into the standards for liability, which is important. I'll engage a little bit more on the standard duty of care. And lastly, we'll talk about the numerous harms that this particular policy does. But before that, some rebuttals that don't fit, right? Because he talked about how FIFA has duty of care with regards to ensuring that people are not harmed on the ground. And have they fulfilled that, right? We think FIFA does as much as it can with regards to years in the lobbying process to scrutinize every detail in the bidding process. And every World Cup, there's at least 2 or 3 bids for the World Cup. So there's a competition for bids. So there's a lot of scrutiny that goes into it. Not to mention the huge media scrutiny that exists in the leading up of the World Cup, right? So we think all those things exist as a check and balance, and to show as we can with regards to preventing these harms from occurring, right? But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, there is a gap between what you promise and what you deliver, Mr. Speaker. I would think the person responsible for that gap ultimately is the individuals that implement it on the ground, right? Secondly, with regards to the exaggeration of the harms, right? We don't think necessarily that individuals dying on the ground of starvation, right? True, individuals have been evicted and individuals have lost more, and it may have needed more compensation, and more could have been done in terms of helping these individuals to normalize into different environments, right? But we don't think that necessarily translates to a full-blown human rights abuse that is comparable to genocide. We think that's incredibly disproportionate and exaggerated on the asset, right? So done with that, let's look into argumentation, right? Before I go into that, sure.
This is not a mutually exclusive policy, right? So governments and implementers of these human rights abuses can also be held criminally liable. If we can prove to your government side that there is a certain degree of involvement of FIFA when it comes to these kinds of abuses, we should agree then. Right? It is mutually exclusive, right? Because once you pin the blame on FIFA, Mr. Speaker, we think there's less incentive to pursue the real perpetrators of the crime. You're more than say, look, we've already pinned the blame on these FIFA executives, let's move on, right? But on the flip side, Mr. Speaker, what happens then is that the FIFA executives are less likely to award the World Cup to countries that are developing because they fear the propensity, they overfear the propensity of these countries to have corruption and for those harms to occur, right? So the harms are definitely exclusive on your side, right? We don't think the benefits necessarily are. Let's move into argumentation, right? First thing is characterization. So I told you earlier, there's a huge media scrutiny, there's a long bidding process, right? And there's constant oversight of people on the ground. So FIFA executives actually go on the ground in the leading up of the World Cup to monitor the particular process, right? So recognize this, right? A lot of the harms that occur may not have ever been highlighted by the media if the World Cup was not being hosted there in the first place, right? So we can argue also that it was because the World Cup was being hosted in Brazil that we know of the kind of faults of the governments in terms of their policies of evicting people, right? We think that we just thought that was a positive thing. But we think also a natural is that because of the huge PR the nightmare that exists, prevent this from happening also, right? So this check and balance also exists. The third check and balance resources, right? So this particular Brazilian government has generated a huge amount of discontent, right? We think it's more likely for them to get voted out, right? So they can be accountable to voters also, right? So we think there is also a check and balance that also exists. But lastly, we're happy to impose more conditions on other countries who want to host the World Cup in the future. This is something we can add on also, right? No problem there. We don't think we need to have a policy of scapegoating and victimizing the executives of the World Cup, right? Second argumentation, where does the human rights abuses happen, right? So now, we think with regards to the eviction of people, right, from homes, with regards to Qatar implementing predatory policies of hiring migrant workers. These are policies that would have existed even without the World Cup, Mr. Speaker. So the World Cup you can't say the World Cup is the cause of these policies. These policies would have existed
anyway, right? We think it's an unfortunate byproduct of the realities on the ground that these policies exist, right? So we think that with regards to liability, right, there is no clear intention of individuals to cause this harm. It's a byproduct of what already exists on the ground, right? Things that, for example, people try to change, but does not succeed in changing as much as they possibly can. So we think that's particularly important. So this moves slightly into method argumentation. So what is the standard for liability, right? Knowing the background. We think the standard for liability, number one, there needs to be an exclusive harm. So these harms must come only as a result of FIFA hosting the World Cup, which is not true. This harm will exist anyway, right? So you can't pin the blame solely on FIFA. Secondly, there needs to be an exclusive cause, right? FIFA needs to be the exclusive cause for these harms, but I already told you that not, right? These harms are caused by the government, right? So that means even if you remove FIFA, if for example they host a different event, those harms will still manifest because the real perpetrator are not the FIFA executives, but are the governments necessarily, right? So you're taking away the highlight in the government over and putting it on the wrong party, right? Because so we think that the harm is that you're blaming the wrong person for this particular policy. We don't think that's fair, right? Now, for the argumentation, right? The particular harms. We think there's a lot of harm to this particular thing, right? Firstly, harm number one, we make these FIFA executives more cautious about avoiding the World Cup. You create a monopoly of Western nations that will never be able to host the World Cup. Only Germany's and the US and the Western nations both, because we are all very confident of their particular standards, right? Which means there's less consideration for things like the culture of Brazil, in terms of the love of football. There's less considerations of these other things in terms of awarding the World Cup, but it's standard policy of awarding it and awarding hosting rights to countries that can guarantee, right? This regards the universal value of sports, right? That's particularly harmful. And lastly, we think you lose neutrality in football, right? Football is supposed to be the last avenue for individuals to be able to compete regardless of the ideology, right, Mr. Speaker. We think it's the last avenue in the international arena for this particular process to happen. We think it's incredibly harmful to lose out on this. We're very proud of those.
And Leader of Opposition for his speech, and I was called upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue his case. Sure.
Here. So they seem to consider that they have rendered our point on the duty of care irrelevant by saying that the FIFA bidding process has greater scrutiny, the media has scrutiny. But let me bring you to the reality of today's world. What happens today is that, is the media really true? No, the media runs on BS in most cases. Furthermore, is this why the Catholic Church gave them the red card? Is this why the Roman Catholic Church in Brazil gave these FIFA executives the red card? Is it because they have been upholding human rights? I think not. Furthermore, they claim that we are exaggerating our harms, that dying of starvation is an exaggerated harm. But we tell you that what you are doing under your paradigm is to remove the livelihood of these people. Because let's take a look at the situation going on for the past few months. How are these human rights abuses carried out? From these residential areas surrounding the locations in which these stadiums are constructed to glorify Brazil and to glorify the World Cup, what really happens? These FIFA executives utilize their machinery to systematically chase away these poor people from their surrounding locations, from the areas they have known their entire life, from their homes, from their grounds, from their livelihood, from their very possessions, the little possessions that they have in this world, and they leave you alone. They do not send you to a specific location. They leave you to fend for yourself in an unforgiving world. They do not even give you any form of recompense in the form of either A, temporary housing, or B, permanent residency in another location, they do not even give you C, monetary aid in relation to them taking away your livelihood. But what they do is to leave you alone in the world to fend for yourself. Cruel.
Sir.
Now, let me explain to you something. So the organization involved media scrutiny and the bidding process, the rigor of the bidding process. They also claim that because it is hosted in Brazil, we know that these kinds of things might actually happen to these poor people, and that it is only a byproduct and not something active which they perpetuate. But we tell you that just because something is a byproduct does not mean that you are not responsible for it. If you slap a person on the head and he dies from it, will you go to jail for murder or will you go to jail for slapping his head? The second level of rebuttal, they claim that conditions are already bad in Brazil. Yes, Brazil is a developing country. To a certain extent, conditions are bad. But they choose to A, proceed ahead with these conditions, B, aggravate these conditions by carrying out numerous human rights abuses, and C, doing nothing to prevent these conditions from steadily worsening under their paradigm. Secondly, next they also mention who should we award this World Cup to, who should we recognize more in the bid. So, even if you do not award the bid to host World Cup to these developing countries, right, we think it's okay, because as you can see what's happening in Brazil, these developing countries should focus on developing themselves first. Now I move on to our bench's second substantive, which is the benefits in terms of the societal mindset. What will happen to this society when the motion is passed? It will actually turn its viewpoint partially from the TV screen, from the World Cup, from focusing on this ball, on Germany, on Argentina, to the plight of the poor people. What happens is that they're going to recognize these poor people as people who require more aid than the footballers do. Now, two things can happen. First of all, the realization that in the midst of such a crowning event in Brazil, there still exist people, poor people who make up a large sphere of society, who require this aid more, who are actually downtrodden by these top executives. And two, they're going to realize two things: the plight of the poor people, and the second thing is the plight of the poor people when oppressed by these executives in carrying out their paradigm. Now, we see the immense pouring of revenue into Brazil as a result of this World Cup. What can result from this, right, is that instead of using this to line their fat pockets, what they are going to do is to they should actually allocate these funds to help the poor people instead. Now, we know that the plight, the reality of these poor folk is clouded out by surrounding events which we, average reasonable folk, happen to give more priority to than the plight of these poor people. Now, what we want to achieve is an exposition of what happens behind the scenes. We want to highlight not only the glory of football, yeah, we all love football, but also the plight of what happens to these poor people. Secondly, if you continue with the motion, what is going to happen is that this will set a precedent. It will create a mindset in top companies, in corporations, that they can exert an advantage over the poor people, that they can step on poor people in order to achieve their goal. So what they're going to do is that they are going to maximize the magnitude of this goal they want to achieve to a similar level to the World Cup in order for them to justify their actions towards these poor people, in order for them to actually legitimize them in the eyes of society, their actions towards these poor people, because they don't care who they are stepping on. They consider these poor people as stepping stones, as a staircase to their glory. So, Mr. Speaker, what have we told you today? We have rebutted what they said about the media scrutiny, the bidding process. We've rebutted the characterization. We have denied to you how byproduct is actually bad, and Yes, we've proven to you the societal mindset and it's affecting people. With that, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your remarks, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give his speech. Here.
Mr. Chair, it is important to acknowledge that because they have a bad time, that's why they don't watch the World Cup, that's why they don't understand it. What is important here is that we answer ourselves a few important questions, right? What exactly is the role of FIFA? What is it that they play? And what are these communal benefits of which both houses seem to want to contend with, right? Those are the questions that we have to answer. So when we look at it, it's very simple, right? Much like how is it that we show the importance of FIFA, we have to look at the guidelines and they have to prove to us why they have failed and they have not. And it's in my speech, I'm going to forward to you what are those exact benefits in terms of what are the physical benefits that FIFA could bring and what are those communal benefits that people could bring about, right? So we know that Chennai is a cock-up, but we have to find evidence before we crucify the World Council for creating so. So here's what is going to happen, right? Rebuttal case against the opening government is very simple. We look at it this way. Their only major contention is that they tell you how is it that abuse does happen. Well, no duh, but what exactly is it, who is causing this, right? That's the question that we have to answer. We are saying that we deny the analysis on how is it that it is unforeseeable, that it is foreseeable for FIFA on how these abuses would happen. In fact, we think that it is unforeseeable as a result of Albert's analysis on how this is a direct byproduct, right? But even if we were to concede and to give that moral efficacy, right, to saying that they are responsible, then we have to look at how is it, or how much that they have done to show that they have failed in order to do so, right? So let's look at that. What exactly is FIFA? FIFA is a multi-billion-dollar franchise, and as a major corporation, then you have corporate social responsibilities towards the places of which you hold them in, right? But the whole idea is this, right? Who actually initiates those activities, right? In terms of building stadiums and planning these routes, and how is it that the event's going to move slowly? Sure, FIFA is a moderator, but they do not create infrastructure that creates all these problems, right? It is the people on the ground, i.e. the government, that actually does so. So we feel that there is a shift in the responsibility of which they have to recognize, right? So what is going to happen here is that we're going to further move on the analysis by saying that, look, FIFA is all inclusive. If we are going to take up higher burdens under their paradigm, then we said that fine, sure, why not? But by being inclusive, is that how is it that Edward has already told you, right? That if you create so much guidelines on how is it that they have to be scrutinizing the government that much by making the FIFA executives liable, well, then you destroy the franchise by denying the accessibility to the poorer countries that are more exempt towards their abuses, because now all they're going to do is this. I know that there are many economic benefits that I could get from having the World Cup, but I'm not going to have those benefits. It is going to cost me to be called Slobodan in the international court. No idiot dictatorship is stupid enough to do so, right? So we deny that problem for which they brought up. So what is important here is this, right? What are the positive contributions of which we're going to make? FIFA ultimately is about the body that creates those different benefits of which everybody could enjoy. These benefits will come on one, how is it that by winning the franchise alone would incentivize economic activity within your nation, right? Something of which poor nations would definitely need. And we're saying that even if you're living under dictatorship that has cronyism within your economy, we're saying that there's still trickling effects down towards the bottom line of the economy in the sense of all the job opportunities which you create and the tourism which you could attract, because everybody wants to watch a game live, right? Much like how is it that Brazil is full of cars because there's too many traffic jams, because there's so many people in there right now watching the World Cup. So we're saying that these are the benefits of which they cannot deny, be it they do it correctly or be it they do it wrongly, right? Second level of analysis, right? It is that when you win the franchise, then you will also have a more imperative to make your country look better, right? We've seen how is it that iron fist dictatorships such as China, for example, has cleaned up their environmental acts in Beijing, for example, to shut down the factories and create a better air quality, right? And it's from that aspect that we've seen how is it that there is at least an initial step towards improving and showing that how improvements can be made. And more than that, one way to say that what happens then then if China, say for example, stops doing all these good things after the event has ended? No, we do not, because by creating the available infrastructure would mean that these countries are naturally incentivized to earn more money by winning more bids in other events, right? It could be the FIFA World Cup now. It also could be they are trying to make sure that the Asian Olympics or the so-called ADIA Commonwealth Games, right, could be held there in the terms that now be at the hell of these football stadiums. You could have the football events within my country, right, to increase the attraction, right? And this attraction that we're saying comes with many different other benefits. So let's talk about these other benefits in terms of the communal benefits that we were looking at, right? So if we want to talk about scrutiny, Mr. Speaker, then it's important that we look at how is it that the ICC, for example, collects evidence in order to submit the case, right? The case requires evidence collection, right? And this evidence collection, we feel, is better with more exposure. So let's talk about exposure after I take one POI from 10. Sit down.
The improvements that were made in China and the collection of the body of evidence that you want for whatever scrutiny is you're talking about is retrospective in nature. After thousands of people would probably die building your stadiums in Qatar. Are you willing to live with that fact?
Tim, if we don't have the Olympics there, you won't even have a case. Shame on you for not giving more exposure in these aspects. We're going to talk about how is it that even with taking into consideration of Tim's consideration on how is it that thousands of people might get affected, we're saying that exposure is still a good thing. Why is that so? In evidence and case building, right, you have to first of all take away on how is it that this is a byproduct, right? So we're looking at who those actual culprits are. We're talking about how is it that these communications or these evidence could be diluted. So we have to clear that up first. So after taking the initial step, we looked at then how is it that FIFA as a body that creates this franchise would be serving better as a moderator that could act as a catalyst on how this information could come out, right? What we know that is that there is media scrutiny, independent media who come in to cover the events, right? But it's not as if that they're just going to look there and look at how Luis Suarez bid another player. They're also looking at how is it that there is a build-up towards the World Cup, right? How do people feel about it? What are the problems that are created? And we highlight it to the international media, right? So two outcomes will come up. One, either that this government naturally incentivizes themselves to be a better government, or secondly, we create a case of which we'll bring up to the ICC and make it more credibility, right? But this does not happen if the FIFA is ultimately placed in in the crossfire, right? Why is that so? Because by doing so would mean that FIFA, as a body that allows all of this to happen, will naturally be disincentivized from going to the country in the very first place. Like I said earlier on, they have to say how is it that they're ultimately so irresponsible that even if they have no benefits, because ultimately we know the franchise benefits the host country and not FIFA in itself, how under their paradigm that their model would work. We don't see any analysis coming from that. So ultimately what's going to happen here is that Albert and I have exclusively told to you that there are benefits that they're going to get, and now how is it that not only does the country benefit, that the ICC or the Federal Ministry also benefits from building a better evidence case, right? So it's about tracking down all of these different numbers by knowing them in the very first place. The cost of effect in this is this, right? By looking at all of these benefits and scrutinizing them further, what we know further. If we don't know, we can't do anything about it. ICC works on evidence gathering, ICC works on more exposure, and if we know that World Cup is so good and that FIFA wants to push World Cup everywhere, then wouldn't it be likely be the net effect whereby more poorer countries, who are, even if their questionable government, want this franchise, and if they want this franchise, that's when the actual scrutiny will be made, that's when more cases will be made towards all these different dictatorships, right? If we could scrutinize China, who else can we not scrutinize? But only if FIFA is not held reliable. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for his speech. Now to begin the closing half of the debate, I invite a member of government to give his remarks. Here.
Of involvement in FIFA when it comes to the human rights violations, either directly or indirectly in these instances, and why FIFA is accountable to no one at this point in time, and something needs to be done. I will also explain to you why the bidding process, how the bidding process works, the expertise that FIFA generally provides when someone wins the bid, and the kind of funding that's involved that directly comes from FIFA, which proves they're culpable. 6 rebuttals before that. Firstly, they tell us scrutiny is high, there are checks and balances already in place, there's a great amount of media scrutiny. Yes, but the media scrutiny doesn't translate into tangible outcomes. FIFA actually takes a stance in solving these issues, or does it incentivize local governments to actively take up measures to improve these kinds of things? This isn't just about Brazil or South Africa. We've had this for decades. So we think even the scrutiny that exists, it's not enough. Secondly, they tell us that it's FIFA is less likely to award third world countries if we are to do this. We'll be the first ones to bite the bullet and to say, if you are a third world nation and if you have proven that you're incapable of hosting a tournament of this magnitude, you shouldn't probably win the bid in the first place, even if it means robbing you of that opportunity, because we think lives are more important. Secondly, then they told us, well, this is a positive thing, right? We now know the dealings of the government. No, we shouldn't employ this manner in order to know how atrocious a fundamental government is. That's just not the moral high ground. Fourthly, they told us there are abuses. These abuses would have happened anyway, and the standard of liability is when there are exclusive harms. Dude, this wouldn't have happened anyway, because we're talking about human rights abuses that have specifically happened because of the awarding of the FIFA bid. So we think that liability in this instance is from FIFA, either directly or vicariously, as long as there's a certain involvement, we should hold that criminally liable. Fifth, foreseeability is an issue. We think that if foreseeability is really ambiguous in this nature, that's when the bids need to be transparent as to why certain countries won or didn't win these forms of bids. Foreseeability is never a justification. But lastly, improvements can be made, just like China said. These improvements are retrospective in nature, dude. We're not willing to let people die first and then to figure out what to do to your countries. How do these bidding processes work? Firstly, there is a plethora of studies that are done from all these bids in order to ensure that they can provide a certain amount of security, the economy is fundamentally good, and there are enough capabilities for facilities. The problem with these studies and the way the bidding process works is it's not transparent. We don't know how Qatar won the World Cup and they're allowed to host the World Cup in summer. We don't know how South Africa won the World Cup and it was fundamentally incapable, as well as Brazil, to host these World Cups because they just lack the kind of funds. The award of these bidding is made on an informed decision that these countries are incapable, yet FIFA chooses to give it to them anyway. FIFA also provides a certain amount of expertise in terms of geographical conveniences, in terms of where you can and cannot build their stadiums. But also they provide funding for countries to sublet to third-party contractors when local governments are incapable of building those infrastructures. So we think there's the vicarious liability that you implore to these people who die because the funding directly comes from FIFA when there's an informed decision. Firstly, why vicarious liability? Number one, there are unreasonable expectations and prerequisites that FIFA generally places on countries, very well knowing that they're capable of doing this. In Qatar, you know very well that workers are going to die because of the heat, but they will go ahead anyway. In South Africa, FIFA knew that there were displacements that were going to happen in villages, and in Brazil, the worker conditions were generally deplorable. FIFA said nothing. Silence is a complicit endorsement that this is something that needs to go through at all costs because it prioritizes its branding anyway. Secondly, FIFA is unwilling to modify these expectations and force these countries to comply. Manaus, and you all saw the John Oliver video, right? Manaus is a stadium that's built in the middle of nowhere in fucking Brazil, where you can't get, where it's not convenient to get to these stadiums, and there is no local football team. Yet they force countries like this to suffer and build these types of stadiums, which will eventually become white elephants. And we think the unwillingness to modify is a direct culpability of why, when workers die and the human rights abuses that happen, they are culpable. Secondly, we tell you that ignorance and negligence is never a defense. The silence or the non-existence of condemnation yet is a complicit endorsement of what's happening. We know it, FIFA damn well knows what's going on. Thirdly, FIFA reaps the majority of the share of profits that are attained through these World Cups that have come at the expense of these lives. That means there is a vicarious, complicit endorsement of the lives that are lost when it comes to these workers dying or when there are human rights abuses like the displacement of villages and the cost of people starving and dying. Before I move on, Ruben.
Why not just punish them for corruption and negligence?
I'll tell you why later. Fourthly, why FIFA is able to hold these countries at ransom in order for them to perform. These bidding decisions, because they are not transparent, there's a certain amount of trust that the international community like you and I grant to them to make the best decisions possible. When those best decisions are not made and lives are lost, everyone suffers. It is a direct violation of trust when people die, and therefore we think that is a problem. To answer your question, corruption just isn't the only problem. It is bad decision making as well that is at play here. When bad decisions are made, they're granted to countries that are incapable of doing this. Yes, it might be because of cronyism, it might be because of corruption, and we have metrics to do with that. But bad decision making that result in the loss of lives of people, that's when criminal liability needs to be employed. Secondly, and finally, Why do we hold? Why should FIFA is accountable to no one? At the moment, the only check and balance FIFA has is towards its own members. The problem is the interdependency, where members of FIFA are dependent on FIFA for funding. Therefore, any form of violation of human rights violations or any form of cronyism or corruption that happens, if there is no incentives for its own members to organically rat FIFA out, because they too are dependent on these types of funding. Criminal liability is the only legal framework that can force FIFA to formally restructure the way it operates. Civil lawsuits don't work. Why? Because it calls itself a non-profit organization with $1 billion in its kitty. We think any form of lawsuit that comes about can be easily paid off in this manner. It doesn't force any internal restructure of its organization. But lastly, any form of lawsuits will have to come from the local governments that win these bids. These governments will either be unlikely or unwilling or incapable of holding these types of lawsuits against such a huge mega organization like FIFA. This just isn't just about corruption or cronyism, those who hold them accountable. Based on its studies and based on its research, that these countries are incapable of holding those World Cups. And because of their decisions as primary causes, people die, people get displaced, and they're abused because of it. Somebody needs to finally do something about FIFA. I'm very proud of you.
Same here.
Thank the member of government for his speech. Now to call upon the member of opposition to present this case. Here.
We need to first understand the full extent of FIFA's power before we are able to analyze whether they could even possibly be criminally liable given the extent of their power, what could possibly done about the solution on the ground. What does FIFA do? It awards bids, they provide regulation of safety standards for stadiums, quality of stadiums, and a lot of things Tim talks about admittedly. But they have little to no control over central planning and infrastructure planning. That's the prerogative of the domestic governments. The issue of national sovereignty that FIFA cannot simply intrude upon should they choose to. Case example of this was when the Brazilian government insisted on staging games in 12 cities, even though FIFA repeatedly counseled Brazil to host it only in 8 to prevent the building of white elephants. The Brazilian government said, hey, we want to spread development across the country, that's our business, not yours. So just the thing, right? Like FIFA couldn't have known that human rights abuses definitely would happen according to Tim, because during the bidding process, no one knew that such abuses would definitely. Right? They provide a lot of advice and money, but providing advice and money to a country doesn't mean I take on all their responsibilities and all their liabilities. Doesn't mean that, for example, like China provides humanitarian development aid to North Korea, or like automatically makes them liable for what Kim Jong-un does to his uncle and feeds him to the dogs, for example, right? So we think it's just wholly unreasonable amount of responsibility they are pinning on FIFA. Like I said, Brazil could have heeded FIFA's advice, but at the end of the day, the poor people who evicted from the favelas were evicted not by FIFA, but by the Brazilian government. You could say, oh, but like where do these people stay now? We say we agree, a lot of people talk over, it's a really sad thing.
But what is FIFA supposed to do? Like, they're not, you don't expect FIFA to then carve out a piece of land somewhere in Brazil and insist that the Brazilian government put out those lands, right? And you know, whether all those people who are displaced from the area put up somewhere else is again the sole prerogative of the Brazilian government. Sit down. So we say the liability lies exclusively with the Brazilian government leaders. We are very happy to prosecute them. But more importantly, if the gut response across the line was that FIFA needs to be made more judicious in the way in which it awards its bidding process, we say that might possibly be a good thing, right? We would all rather have a World Cup in USA instead of Qatar, so long as Alaska is not a whole city. But that being said, right, we think the ICC case against Brazil and Qatar would be sufficient to deter future bids from any of those countries who seek to host those bids while perpetrating those human rights abuses, which means that there's, like, in the first place, the problem we solve once you hold those countries' leaders accountable, but B, to the extent that, like, that actually happens, people will now also take that into account because they don't want to be seen awarding bids to countries who then end up being prosecuted by the ICC anyway. So we think there's no real exclusive benefit to an additional indictment on FIFA executives. But let's assume that there is, to give them some credit. Then we say all they are doing is using the criminal prosecution of FIFA executives, telling them that they're guilty of crimes against humanity as a social battering ram to bring about changes, force upon changes within the way FIFA operates. And we don't think can ever take a consequentialist approach based on how FIFA would react to justify scapegoating someone if they are not directly responsible. We think we talk about any criminal case, you have to consider the specific facts of the case to determine guilt of the individual and whether or not there's evidence beyond all reasonable doubt, instead of simply using the justification of, oh, but FIFA might be more transparent after that. Well, we say, well, that might be a good thing, it's a huge perversion of justice, the way in which they try to bring that about. We think there are ways to make the FIFA process better, but the way to do it, like the fact that it isn't good in the first place just means that, like, things are stupid in the way, like the way things are done is stupid. That doesn't make it fundamentally criminal.
That was built in South Africa and as well as Manaus. Both these local governments went back to FIFA to tell them that the terrain was not flexible and it's not conducive. FIFA told them to go ahead anyway and it cost a lot of lives. Are you willing to live with that?
Wait, hang on, I already told you, FIFA said 8, Brazil said 12. So I don't know what's this city that you dealt with. My statistic is quoted from The Economist, you can go and read it, right? So, and like, furthermore, right, FIFA is not an agent with powers to prevent human rights abuses in the first place. You see, true to a certain extent, they enable a bid to proceed. True to a certain extent, they maintain silence over what has happened. But in the first place, like, FIFA is a sporting body, something I explained right from the start. They're not responsible for championing human rights abuses. And like, even if they were in some case, the fact not that you did not actively do something to protect people from harm doesn't mean that you did something positive that you can throw. You should be punished or held liable for something. It's like it's a horrible slippery slope. What the sort of idea in which government is trying to logic all the member nations who chose to participate in the World Cup, chose not to do something, to boycott the World Cup in the first place, also enable the World Cup to happen. All the winners who went to the World Cup to celebrate the World Cup, and all the tourists who went there to watch the World Cup, and all of us who watch the World Cup in front of screens, paying good money that also goes to FIFA, are also liable in some way. But that doesn't make us criminally liable, does it? Because criminal liability is a very specific form of liability that requires specific forms of evidence and direct responsibility, and that simply doesn't exist with FIFA. We think it's a noble aim on their side to want to change the way FIFA works, but throwing lawsuits at them is not the way.
Thank the member of opposition for his speech, and I call upon the government whip to run over this case to this side. Hear, hear.
reason why Sepp Blatter will fear going to the courts is because he knows that he will be charged. Because if you're really innocent, right, you need not fear the justice. So I'll talk to you about a few things. Firstly, let's talk about this idea of standards of criminal liability. Whether using the existing legal framework, do we have grounds to persecute and hold FIFA liable? Right? OG already tell you this. We can hold them by the charge of criminal negligence. Actually, they didn't use that phrase, so you must give me credit for that. So there are three parts to that. Firstly, you have a duty of care. We think FIFA very explicitly have that duty of care because you oversee the entire process and the project, including the bidding and everything that goes on concerning the World Cup. Second part, there is a breach of duty. They are complicit and they facilitate all your human rights abuses. Thirdly, there are actual harms incurred. We already spelled it out to you, right? So Ruben asked this very weird UI. Why not just charge them with corruption and negligence? But that is criminal liability. So I don't know what's the mutually exclusivity of say, oh, let's charge them with corruption because those things are crime. So maybe let's give him the best case scenario if he wants to try to push forward with the idea of civil suits. And Tim already dealt with it. He tell you why civil suits will never work because these countries like South Africa, like Brazil, its people are held ransom by poverty, right? So it's very easy for FIFA to just pay them off and continue with their act year after year. But secondly, no thank you. Now you're expecting to tell me that FIFA goes to the Brazilian court and the Brazilian government will give fair jurisdiction and ask FIFA to pay when they are the people who allowed FIFA to come in and exploit their people in the first place. Simply illogical, right? And then they tell you this warped idea, right? Okay, there are some benefits that FIFA have given towards their people, so let's not hold them liable. Drug cartels create jobs and business administration training to their drug mules. Those are benefits. That does not mean you let them go off scot-free because that's not the yardstick of what criminal justice is, as long as those harms are incurred, right? And then they try to tell you, paint like FIFA as this hero. You expose the corruption in hosting countries. FIFA is good, so you should allow them to continue with the human rights abuses so we can call out these countries. Even if that is true, consistently calling out or exposing the corruption in those countries will never have a tangible, beneficial outcome unless you have a jurisdiction and force FIFA or the countries liable, right? By that logic, we shouldn't hold ISIS criminally liable because they expose the corruption and the failure of the Iraqi government, okay? And then they say, foreseeability is a problem. FIFA never have any idea that these these things are going to happen. Maybe I can believe that if Brazil is the first time that FIFA is doing this. But when the track record is that it consistently repeats this act in South Africa, in Brazil, and then in Qatar, it's very difficult to tell me and persuade us that FIFA is really blind to all these things that are happening. And Tim already tell you this, when when Brazil wanted to not build or to modulate the terms of building the stadium in Manaus, FIFA pushed away because the branding of the World Cup, because FIFA wants to uphold the image, right? So all your very first-class stadiums all have to be built regardless of the local conditions of the hosting country. But if FIFA really did fulfill all its duties and really did go through all the procedures that it has, why does it have to obscure the process of the bidding and all of the process of all those things, right? The very fact that they obscure the process, we think there is something fishy going on. Of course, we'll bring them to the courts. I'll take one from Protein. Okay.
Matt, how successful is trying to hold them criminally liable going to be? Because if the standard is so high, it's going to be incredibly difficult to prosecute them, which means your benefits don't happen, but our harms still do.
When the liability is high, it's harder to persecute. I don't get that logic. When the liability is high, it's easier for you to persecute. That is it. So this argument, let's assume, they say if you hold FIFA liable, then countries will be off scot-free. That's the mutual exclusivity. If you blame FIFA, liabilities will be off countries. We don't think that is true. In fact, if you persecute FIFA, it's much easier to persecute and hold countries responsible. And that is the positive change that we want to tell you. Because the moment you persecute FIFA, it will spit out every single evidence that incriminates country leaders to shave off a bit of a burden of FIFA's own back. We call that plea bargaining, right? So in any case, since you're already collecting evidence for trial, why not, right? Might as well just persecute these countries, persecute FIFA and countries leader together. We make things easier, right? No. Even if we are using FIFA as a stepping stone, we don't think that is something bad. Firstly, because it is a necessity, right? If no one stops FIFA, if these things will continue to happen year after year, because no one can check against FIFA. And the failure of the side of opposition is this, that there's no counter model, right? As much as they accuse us of scapegoating FIFA and putting undue burden onto FIFA, they do nothing to stop the abuses. Lastly, they say, poorer countries will never get to host these World Cup anymore. We're happy if Botswana and Chennai will never hold Worlds anymore, right? But that is exactly what we want. If the cost of these poorer countries who have proven to not be able to host your tournaments mean that they will not host any tournament in future, that means lesser human rights abuse, that means less people die, that means the restructuring of FIFA and our criminal persecution actually bear fruit. And that is something that side opposition conceded throughout the bench because of the argument that they make that poorer countries will not want to host it anymore. That is how Endgame conceded right from the beginning. They tried to score in this debate and we feathered it off like a first-class goalkeeper. We're very proud of it.
Then the government whip for a speech and I'll call upon the opposition whip to wrap up this case and the debate. Here,
Mr. Speaker, the law has to be clear and effective in its application in the prosecution of human rights abuses. We have to be judicious in how it is utilized and not just arbitrarily accord liability just because evil acts have been perpetrated. Because otherwise, where do we draw the line? That is why we have distinctions between criminal acts and how they are punished. Prosecution for human rights abuses carries far greater weight and by extension penalties than negligence or corruption. And the difference must be maintained and protected in order to ensure consistency in legal application and integrity of these courts. In the same way, we don't hold Russia liable for the atrocities they are committed by Assad just because they sold arms. In the same way, we cannot hold the US liable for the oppression of Palestinians because the Americans provide military aid. The same way, we will never blame the World Council for the failure of the Malaysian bid to include Israelis. We cannot extend liability here. Arguing vicarious liability alone is not only tenuous, but simply does not hold the same weight as direct liability. What are the benchmarks for criminal liability? And let's give them some credit, said it was foreseeability. Beyond asserting that it was foreseeable, I think Alfred gave you excellent analysis as to why FIFA just couldn't do anything about it, right? Because A, the bids do not include the manner in which these revenues will be constructed. Then sit down, give your POI to Deborah, it will come out a lot more clearer from her. The bids never included the long hours of the workers, the risk of death, and the sort of home abuses that companies commit with these workers. The favelas that will be demolished within the construction, right? The oppression of the people, especially the poor, that happens within the construction of these stadiums. The reason for this, and the reason why FIFA has no foreseeability, It's because these bids always publish legitimate means for hosting the World Cup. Obviously, otherwise the bids would never gain any form of international traction. So FIFA always errs on the side of believing that, hey, maybe you have legitimate means for the construction of these stadiums and for the hosting of this World Cup. You said you would, so we trust you to do it. The choice to commit these acts, I'll take Deborah later, right? The choice to commit these acts always happens after the bids were awarded. Why? Because countries can get away with this due to the lack of jurisdictional power that FIFA holds after the bid is awarded. Like Alfred explained, that their powers only extend to whether these stadiums meet sporting requirements. To hold FIFA liable is to punish them for powers that they do not have and will never feasibly have in the first place, right? They cannot dictate how these contracts or to whom these contracts are awarded to, because that will amount to a gross violation of the country's individual sovereignty, right? So we think that that's something that FIFA could never possibly ultimately achieve. Okay, Deborah.
FIFA knows that building a stadium in the designated area which they chose will displace people. Is that not foreseeability for FIFA?
Okay, if FIFA knows, shouldn't do this, but they can't be held liable for it, right? Like we explained that the benchmarks are far more higher. Just because FIFA said nothing does not mean they should be held liable. And Alfred established this, right? Because these abusers have to fall within the direct locus of control. Even if FIFA told them not to do these things, these countries still can do it anyway, right? FIFA has no power to control these countries in the first place. First off, FIFA actually has made an active step to prevent these sort of human rights abuses, right? They told Brazil to continue hosting the World Cup in huge the massive stadiums that already exist because of the massive football teams there, right? In Rio, in Sao Paulo, in Brasilia, right? So they did fulfill their duty on that level. But secondly, just saying nothing and standing by has never been a benchmark for liability. Like we gave you a higher standard. You have to be an agent for those abusers. Just because you stood by and did nothing, the fact is the perpetrator of these crimes has always been the local governments in play. What was the entire government's bench response to this, right? Oh, we will result in all sorts of benefits like better decision making and finding out more evidence about these abusers and the like. We think that's completely ridiculous. But to adjudicate that very scenario. No, you're not giving them a trial, you're just charging them with it, right? You're saying that you are criminally liable. So you're making a judgment beforehand. So we don't think that is that makes any sense. But we also told you that FIFA just can't do anything about it in the first place, right? Just because you have tangential benefits like a better decision-making process, those are things which are not mutually exclusive and don't require the according of criminal liability in the first place. We can easily hold them liable for corruption and negligence in how they adjudicate these bids in the first place, which are already being done anyway, right? When we do a court liability for bad decision-making processes is when FIFA had the intent to commit these acts and to enable these acts. And it's impossible to prove that they have done so, right? Given that their only interest extends to the ability to protect football as a sport, right? Just because there's this entire concept of digging evidence and finding out more about these human rights abuses doesn't justify according them criminal liability and punishing these individuals because they ultimately did not have the ability to do so, right? So what we told you today, we told you that there needs to be consistency in the law, and the benchmark for criminal liability for human rights abuses carries a far higher standard than all the other actual crimes that you have talked about, like corruption and negligence, which we are perfectly fine to concede. So we think that's important not just to look at foreseeability, but to adjudicate, has FIFA been an agent for those human rights abuses? Just because they gave money or just because they awarded the rights to host the World Cup, which allowed for these abuses to exist, doesn't make them directly liable for these crimes. Just because we have other tangential benefits which can be achieved in far more effective ways doesn't justify holding these people and labeling them criminals. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
everyone shake hands. The judges will adjourn to the other room to make their decision.
Good job, David.
Mustafa?
Hey. I'm on the main street.